Hello, everybody. I will wait one more minute just for everyone to join, and then we'll kick off. All right, let's do it. Thank you so much to everyone for joining. We had a huge amount of interest in this webinar on Article 6 in CORSIA. It seems like every time we do an analysis or a piece of work on CORSIA, we get a lot of interest. I think that reflects where the market is today. So we're excited to be discussing it. Over the next 45 minutes or so, we'll be discussing the state of the market. We'll do a level set on where we are, on supply conditions, on pricing, on the broader policy context, and share some headline findings from our CORSIA and Article 6 modeling, as well as showing you some of the data that underpins that. We will hold a Q&A at the end for 10 minutes or so, so please feel free to submit questions as we go. So let's get into it. Before we dive in, a quick word on who you'll hear from today. On the right, I'm Rory, General Manager at Silvera, and I'll be moderating the discussion. I'm joined by Aaron and Ben, who lead our CORSIA and Article 6 analysis in-house, and they'll be taking you through the headline findings and kind of the broader policy environment that we're operating in. We're also lucky enough to be joined by Molly, who is a senior fellow at Silvera, as well as being the acting chair of the technical advisory body, and honestly, just a general CORSIA rock star. So great to have you here, Molly. Awesome. So let's get into it. I thought it'd be useful, everyone's kind of entering this market at different stages of sophistication and understanding of where the market's been to date. So just to level set, really, the old mental model for carbon markets was essentially siloed. Voluntary demand pulled from voluntary supply, compliance buyers were operating essentially in their own lane. The markets were distinct, and the assumption was that the supply sources and the demand sources were kind of naturally matched within each other's lanes. And that's changing. So what's emerging through Article 6 and the rule book agreed at COP29 is a standardized global framework. It's not uniform, but it's standardized. So the practical effect of that is, for today's market, the question that's being asked is no longer which registry or is it voluntary versus compliance use case. It's a single binary. It's, does the credit carry a corresponding adjustment? Has the host country essentially issued an export approval? If yes, then it's legal tender under the Paris Agreement and can serve any demand source. So CORSIA, a sovereign NDC buyer, a domestic compliance scheme, a voluntary buyer. If no, then it still has a home in voluntary or domestic markets, but it can't cross that kind of international compliance threshold. So that's quite a big implication, right? Suddenly you have projects, you have supply sources that aren't built to serve one specific demand channel. If they have a corresponding adjustment, it can serve multiple demand sources, and we're getting to kind of an interoperability between different markets that fundamentally shifts how supply and demand operates and interacts. So if we go to the next slide, we can look at what the demand is for these adjusted credits. So when we look at actually who is buying or who is in the market to buy Article 6 adjusted credits between now and 2030, it is important to distinguish between two types of demand, CORSIA in the green and sovereign NDC demand in the purple. If we start with the purple, based on official statements, ITMO demand for NDC use by governments will be at around 300 million tonnes. which means that just over 2/3 of total ITMO demand to 2030 will be from the green in CORSIA. So CORSIA, the characteristics of that demand is quite fundamentally different from sovereign NDC demand. CORSIA is a compliance obligation. Airlines have a very defined liability. They have a clear timeline. They have established procurement processes, and the specs are quite straightforward. If a credit is CORSIA eligible, kind of fits, and we would expect buyers to care about delivery, timing, and price. Sovereign NDC demand is fundamentally different in character. It kind of represents the voluntary market in many ways. Every sovereign buyer has different shapes to their preferences. Some want nature-based, some explicitly exclude it. Some will prioritize specific technologies. Most will filter by a country or a country of origin, based on the relationship they're trying to build or strengthen. So it's very fragmented, it's preference heavy, it's certainly still maturing in terms of infrastructure. So to 2030, the focus really is on that green CORSIA. CORSIA is the anchor for that demand. It represents the largest, the most certain source of demand for adjusted credits, and that is where the volume is. This is representative. Demand could be higher. New buying countries could enter the picture. Aviation sector emissions could rise faster than expected. It could also be lower, right? So prospective buying countries could do better than expected against their NDCs. They could choose to fall short of their NDCs. And a supply-constrained environment might mean that we're just unable to match the demand. So ballpark, the numbers could be up or down, but ballpark, we expect CORSIA to be dominating demand for adjusted credits to 2030. So what does the market look like today for CORSIA? In short, undersupplied and underpriced. So the left-hand side of the slide shows the broad supply picture for CORSIA Phase 1. The red line at 163 million is the total CP1 demand, excluding intra-EEA emissions, which form part of the EU ETS. That's kind of the bar that we need to meet. So if we look at the bar on the left in purple, we can currently identify and name 37 million, I think it's the 37.55 million tons that are confirmed eligible. They meet all the requirements and are good to go. There's an additional expected 10 million in that bucket that will confirm eligibility and issue before the CP1 deadline, 30th Jan 2028. In cyan, there are 17 million tons that have already been issued and that we deem to have a very high probability of gaining authorizations and therefore being eligible for CP1, and an additional 40 million yet to issue. In this, and Ben will unpack this a little bit more, high eligibility or high probability is deemed originating from a host country where the LOA and CA risk scores are low, under 50%. So there is a clear Article 6 and CORSIA framework within that country. The host country is making strong progress towards both LOA issuance and converting those LOAs into CAs and recognizing them. As we move to the right, the probability, the uncertainty gets higher. So in orange, there are 78 million tons that are already issued and have a low likelihood of eligibility, with a further 119 million to be issued in that category. So low eligibility here represents, medium probability here represents, it's plausible and the intent exists. However, there are some kind of structural policy gaps or reporting uncertainty that could undermine authorization or CA recognition if left unaddressed. And then finally, there's the final bucket, which is low probability, and we see 168 million in that bucket that have already been issued, and with an additional 171 that we would expect to see issued by the deadline. So the grand totals there are in bold, 340 million and 300 million to be issued and issued respectively, taking us to a grand total of 640 million. On the right is some pricing from the ICE futures. And you can see that that pricing, both spot and futures, are falling. And they're falling at quite a rate. We saw them break $10 per ton recently. And this is kind of a central paradox of the CORSIA market right now on this slide, right? We have a structural supply gap challenge, and yet the spot prices are falling. So this credit pricing is kind of fundamentally being driven by uncertainty and not the long-term fundamentals of the market. Indeed, Silvera's forward analysis points in a slightly different direction. It's highly uncertain, but we expect the ceiling to be much higher as we approach that CP1 deadline. So some really interesting dynamics, and I think it's worth thinking through like what is driving that uncertainty. And for that, I'm going to hand over to Ben, who's going to talk us through a bit more of the policy context and some more of the data. So over to you, Ben.
Thanks very much, Rory. And thanks also, Aaron, for the slides. So yeah, Rory kind of set the stage there for the paradoxical nature of the CORSIA market right now. Undersupplied, and yet the price is falling. This is not a functional market. So why is this happening? Well, essentially, what I want to try and explain in 1 or 2 minutes here is that every actor within this market currently is behaving rationally, but collectively that means that the market is itself dysfunctional. And of course, that is not sustainable. And we do think that things will shift quite a bit over the next 12 to 18 months. But just to try and unpack where we are right now, all parties are behaving rationally depending on what their perspectives are and the uncertainties that they face. Between $2 and $5 billion is due to be spent on CORSIA credits over the next 18 months or so, depending on what we assume to be the average price. But essentially, large sums of money are at stake here. So this is very significant, of course, for the carbon market. And the clash of cultures that is mentioned on the slide here refers to the fact that CORSIA is kind of forcing these actors that don't normally engage in such detail together. So that's the Article 6 crowd, particularly on the host country side, and then the international airlines, and particularly the chief risk officers and chief financial officers in these international airlines. Historically, these people have not had to learn about the nuances of Article 6 and the rules for corresponding adjustments, but they are currently all taking a crash course. No bad pun intended. And definitely this month is key. So why is that? Well, let's look at the demand side. So these are the airlines. What do they see? They see some significant policy uncertainty at the macro level, in particular, the positioning of the European Union and the United States on CORSIA. The EU has historically been pretty strong on CORSIA, but has, if anything, been a bit hard on it. There are elements within the European Union that say it's not ambitious enough, that the EU should be going further, even if that means going unilaterally, which of course is quite controversial with international partners. And the US kind of has the opposite challenge, where the administration, as we'll all know right now, is not particularly supportive of climate action in general and has not been particularly vocal about the importance of CORSIA specifically. There are definitely going to be discussions behind the scenes at the more working level of the US administration about this, but at least the political level is not really something that we would expect to be discussed. So the positions of the EU and the US are critical. We also have the matter of the war in Iran. There is currently, I believe, a 60-day ceasefire that was signed a couple of days ago, and hopefully that will be extended, but that has had major repercussions for the aviation sector. And that's been reflected in our modeling, actually, increasing the price of jet fuel, reducing air traffic. There's also this question, the third bullet there, of the lack of supply. As we've just seen from Rory, the market is significantly undersupplied. And so airlines are kind of looking around saying, well, why should I buy credits if there aren't going to be enough for my competitors to also buy? We need to know that there's going to be enough supply for the market to clear before we feel fully comfortable diving in. Then there's the concept of hedging windows, which is essentially the 12 to 18 month window that most procurement is done by airlines. And so we're only now entering that period for the deadline of January 2028 for CORSIA Phase 1. So it's not got a huge amount of attention from the average airline over the last couple of years, but definitely now it is becoming a topic to consider, even though there are other big issues such as Iran on their radar as well. And then the compliance uncertainty refers to the fact that individual countries under CORSIA are actually responsible for ensuring the compliance of the airlines that they oversee. And there is a bit of a patchwork quilt of how different countries have been choosing to regulate or not regulate in order to try and mandate adherence to CORSIA's requirements. Some countries have been quite strong, other countries have not really said anything yet. On the supply side, very briefly, so the supply side here being the host countries, which are providing the letters of authorization corresponding adjustments. Low prices and low demand does not incentivize rushing into this market. There's the same questions around the macro policy situation, and some of the system rules around Article 6 and corresponding adjustments are a little bit unclear to some of these host countries. This is new territory for them, and some of the early movers here have been criticized for inconsistencies in the technical expert reviews under the Paris Agreement. So there's a bit of reluctance, I think, because of that. There's always going to be internal politics between transport ministries, prime minister's offices, environment ministries, financial ministries, and so on. So that's the case in any system. And then the Iran war is also having a particular effect on the global south, which tend to be the host countries here. So Aaron, next slide, please. So that kind of sets the scene for where we are right now. These are the headline numbers that the models currently show us, and Aaron is going to unpack this and give us more detail in a couple of minutes when I hand over to him. We've already seen from Roy that the current eligible supply of eligible emissions units, EEUs, 38 million, of which almost 400,000 have been retired already by a handful of airlines. The likely supply for phase 1, we currently predict between 104 and 157 million tons. And then the demand is in blue on the right-hand side. We expect that to be between 122 and 163 million tons. So there's very clear overlap between those ranges, but it's not a perfect overlap. The other thing I'd point out here is that the CP1 demand in black there, 181 to 198 million tons, this is the full formal offsetting requirements under the rules of CORSIA. The reason why the demand numbers are slightly lower is because there have been some quirks there. So one of these, for example, is the fact that flights within the European Economic Area are currently not expected to comply with their obligations under CORSIA because they are covered by the EU's ETS as it applies to aviation. So that's where there's some differences between the overall formal offsetting requirements and then the expected demand for phase 1. And if we can have the next slide, please. Okay, briefly, the different levels of confidence that we have projected for host countries providing the letter of authorization and the corresponding adjustments in order to make credits eligible for CORSIA Phase 1 refer to these different levels that you can see here on the slide. So high confidence, 21% of host countries currently. This is countries that have LOA and corresponding adjustment risk scores up to 50%, no higher than 50%. The watch list you can see there in the middle is that either of the LOA or the corresponding adjustment risk scores are between 50% and 75%, and then the low probability, so the higher risk host countries, either or both of the LOA and corresponding adjustment risks are 76% or higher. And that's how we segmented the different levels of supply in the waterfall chart that Rory showed a few minutes ago. And I should say that Molly, in a couple more minutes, is going to unpack what we mean by this, these risk scores for letters of authorization and corresponding adjustments at the host country level. But that's just to set a bit more of the scene. And with that, I'll hand over to Aaron for the next section.
Thank you, Ben. I'll continue to explain our analysis. So Ben has covered the supply side situation. So on the demand side, we have looked at aviation emissions because that underpins the offsetting requirements. And of course, the conflict in the Middle East has introduced some uncertainty on air traffic volumes and therefore emissions. What you're looking at on this slide is our estimates of monthly emissions covered under phase 1 of CORSIA. So 2024 is well known, it's published by ICAO. 2025, we could estimate using aircraft radiation transmission data. And similarly for 2026, we could extrapolate forward, but then there's a substantial uncertainty around the rerouting that happened in the last 2 months. It also involves the fuel supply and prices that will impact the aviation sector. So overall, we look at a considerable amount of uncertainty for 2026 emissions. Across the 3 scenarios, we look at escalation, prolonged fuel shortage, and quick recovery. And that brings the total of offsetting requirements, as Ben mentioned, between 181 to 198 million tons. But in terms of actual demand under phase 1, as Ben mentioned, it could be smaller than the offsetting requirements. And this table illustrates why. Technically, CORSIA Phase 1 covers flights between member states that are under phase 1. And that could be illustrated in the black rectangle border with the 4 colors. However, we know that flights to and from EEA member states are already part of the EU ETS. That means they're unlikely to form part of the actual demand for CORSIA credits. Now, what's remaining within that rectangular box is the green, yellow, and the blue parts. And the question is there, well, of that total, what's the share of demand that could come through? And there are a few uncertainties around that. As Ben mentioned, there is a question around to what extent US airlines will form part of that demand. US airlines is around 55 million tons in 2024 in terms of reported emissions within the CORSIA scope. And furthermore, there's a question of what would the EU decide regarding the extension of the EU ETS. So, and that might take out some parts of demand as well if that happens. So we're, of course, looking out for the upcoming decisions quite closely. So that is the demand picture we've looked at. Combining with the supply side uncertainty, we looked at a number of scenarios. On this slide, you look at a table of some of the scenarios we've considered in this analysis so far. On the supply side, we look at 3 possible paths of host country authorizations between being a severely constrained outcome to a rapid expansion in host country authorizations. Now, I should say, while these are scenario assumptions, in the real world, host country decisions could also react to market signals and what demand they're seeing on the market. Another uncertainty, as I said earlier, is the extent of CORSIA implementation. So whether we have a base case where you effectively have all of the CORSIA covered flights implemented, except for the intra-EEA components. And then there are 2 scenarios where we look at what if the US airlines demand do not materialize, and what if the EU extends the EU ETS further. The third area of uncertainty is just aviation traffic. As I showed earlier, there's some uncertainty around aviation traffic for the rest of the year. So we look at 3 outcomes over there as well. So combining these scenarios, we look at 27 scenarios, which gives us a range of outcomes. Now, of course, there are other uncertainties, of course, yeah, but we haven't explored here so far. For example, there could be knock-on effects in terms of implementation and timelines for compliance. Across these scenarios, as I introduced earlier, we look at what prices could be towards the end of phase 1 and what prices could be in early phase 2. On this chart, you see the low, median, upper bound of the prices we have modeled so far across these, say, 27 scenarios. In phase 1, we look at a range between $15 to $52, with median around $33 per ton. And as I said earlier, the higher price scenarios come from situations where there's a genuine scarcity of supply. And in those cases, the market could be quite uncertain. We do not know yet to what extent that will happen, but as a principle, it's possible that there aren't enough credits for airlines by January 2028. As for phase 2, prices are also equally influenced by supply-demand conditions. There's a real constraint on supply as well. However, because there is a little bit more time for host countries to prepare the institutional frameworks and capacity to provide authorizations, there are some scenarios where supply is more relaxed compared to, say, the near term in late 2027, early 2028. With that, I'll pass back to Rory to say a few words about how we, as Silver, are working with people to support this market.
Thank you, Aaron and Ben. Super useful overview, and yeah, we've been discussing the kind of outputs of the modeling exercise that we've been doing. We'll be compiling that into a report that will be available very soon, and will be shared with all of you after this. We work with a lot of market participants that are not always satisfied with the outputs, and actually want to see under the hood and see what is driving the outputs and the results, and just want access to the underlying data. So we are going to do a brief demonstration of a new tool that we have, which allows our users to play around with that underlying data and see what is driving these projections, and actually change the input assumptions and disagree with some of our views, and see what the net impact is on the market. So we're going to do 2 demos. The first will be run by Molly, and that's going to go through the LOA and corresponding adjustment risk scoring framework that we've created. We've done that across I think upwards of 80 countries now, so over 95% of all ITMO supply. And yeah, kind of very similar to how Silvera approached project ratings. We have devised a system to allow market participants to kind of scrutinize these risks in a consistent, transparent, and comparable way. We know this market is super fast moving. We know that it's super complicated to kind of keep track of it and compare risks side by side. So this framework aims to kind of standardize and quantify those risks for you. The second part of the demo will be driven by Aaron. We are tracking reams and reams of data, and we are surfacing that on this platform. So Aaron's going to talk through how we're tracking, what data points, and talk through some of the market projections under different demand and supply scenarios. And I'm going to hand over to Molly first, to talk about the LOA and CA risk framework. Molly, over to you.
Great, thank you, and happy to see everyone on the call today, and the interest in this work. I'm going to talk through a specific part of the Article 6 in CORSIA Hub, focused on countries' implementation of Article 6.2, which has implications for their NDC implementation under the Paris Agreement, other parties' NDC implementation under the Paris Agreement, so not just host countries, and then the impacts on CORSIA and some of the data that underpins the analysis that others like Aaron are undertaking. And so we have a country profile page for every country, or we've started with a subset of countries, and we'll continue to expand on the number of these pages over time, but have prioritized countries that have already provided letters of authorization. And there are several dozen of these, approaching 100 letters of authorization, and several dozen countries that have so far engaged in that effort. And so just to give you a quick overview of this page, before I start, I just wanted to say, you'll hear us talk about risk. This is distinct from how we had scored country profiles for market readiness previously, where it was more about readiness than risk. And that's because this really is, this issue is where the actions, the reporting by countries, does have direct implications for from carbon credit project developers, suppliers, and those engaging in the commercialization of credits. And when we say LOA risk, because we speak very generally about these things, this means that, you know, while LOAs may be possible, maybe they are incremental, they're preferential, or they may just sort of cut off and say no more LOAs at some point, when the amounts of corresponding adjustments committed reach a certain saturation rate. And so we've looked at those sort of eventualities for different countries based on some of the other scoring factors in this section. When we say corresponding adjustment risk, we know that there are provisions in Article 6.2 guidance that discourage the revocation of corresponding adjustments, even just the reported amounts that have been committed for corresponding adjustments. But that may not happen on time to avoid triggering the replacement of credits that have been committed under those LOAs, or it may scale back LOA coverage. So the volume of corresponding adjustments that will be applied, it may be scaled back in response to intense scrutiny from the Article 6 technical expert review. There are any number of reasons why this could happen. And here and elsewhere, I think scoring may seem harsh, and Silvera had a lot of back and forth about how to strictly score these aspects, because we don't want to create a new sort of unique or an accurate source of uncertainty. And so we work very hard in making sure that all of this information is up to date. But there is simply a lot of uncertainty and diversity in the state of readiness of countries for providing LOAs, or differences in terms of the need for refinement of LOAs that do exist so that they can work for CORSIA. And there's a long way to go. And so what we have presented here is helpful, including for countries and those who are providing capacity building support, to know where to focus. And, especially for these countries that have sort of taken a big leap in providing this information. There will be an event hosted by Silvera, IATA, AIDA, a couple of other groups next week, June 22nd at London Climate Action Week, to celebrate countries that have so far provided this information, but to also explain how this can help them improve their work. And so the first thing we look at, Article 6 participation risk. For example, if a country is already participating in Article 6, has provided LOAs, they're going to score pretty positively here. For some other measures, institutional capacity risk, for example, if a country has not indicated who their point of contact is, if that's not established in some sort of regulatory or formal framework, or if it changes frequently, that score may move more toward the risky end of the spectrum. Infrastructure risk, we even look at this for countries that have not yet provided letters of authorization, because they could in the future. And we want to make sure that they are best prepared for accessing that information, even if they're not required to. So there are some of these scores that are undertaken, applied to countries that have not yet engaged at all. The scope and the clarity of authorizations, how much has a country thought through what it might authorize and the rationale for that? Have they done a deeper analysis of their NDC to understand where international direct investment may be needed, or where they've got it covered domestically with domestic capital or regulation? NDC impact risk, do they have a strategy to manage the risk of overcommitting their corresponding adjustments? Track record risk, have they provided letters of authorization? And if so, have any of those been rolled back, refined, changed in ways that had meaningful implications for what is or is not covered by that letter of authorization? Are the letters of authorization and how they're provided efficient, scalable in terms of the process? If a country is going one project at a time, is that going to contribute to scalable approaches over time? Is it slowing down as more projects come into the pipeline? Is there a bottleneck there? And how likely is that to continue? Do the key elements of the authorization include all of those that are actually required under Article 6.2? Those requirements are recent. They were adopted at the end of 2024 by Paris Agreement parties. So some letters of authorization don't include them. All of those elements are pretty necessary for a standards body to know what is actually authorized in terms of the units that they have certified. A big important measure here is saturation risk. How much has a country committed? If you were to look at their most recently reported NDC emissions, what chunk of that volume is then being added to that volume in terms of corresponding adjustments. How do these two things compare? Most countries are not at the risky end of this spectrum. A couple of them are. And so that helps provide some clarity, transparency around how these amounts are adding up. We focus a lot on report timeliness, the timeliness of the submission of different reports and how late those might be, or how timely they are, obviously, because all of these add up. There's a cumulative effect. If you're missing the report where you include annual volumes of amounts that have been authorized, then when a BTR is submitted where the corresponding adjustments are reflected, we don't really know which underlying crediting amounts are encompassed in those national totals. Or those national totals may not represent everything that they were intended to. And so this is an important one to pay attention to. Are the reports complete? So is everything that's required in them? Are they accurate in terms of their consistency with Article 6.2 guidance, how the math is applied? Are all of the required steps taken in that respect? And then looking at the GHG inventory itself, you know, if a project comes from a particular sector, what is the state of data in that sector? Is it even in the inventory? And if it is, what is the quality of the data? And so all of these things add up under different categories. Those are presented at a high level in different analyses on some of the main pages in this tool to give you a global picture. And so now I'll hand it over to Aaron to talk a little bit about those higher level market measures.
Yeah, thanks, Molly. Let me just jump in while Aaron pulls up the second screen. So Molly gave a great overview of the 14 critical parameters that we're scoring systematically across all of these different host countries. I'll jump in and say there is a huge amount of thought and detail that goes into informing those 14 parameters, and we do have like a detailed methodology breakdown in the tool. This market is complicated, the data is very fragmented, and kind of comparing risks side by side is very hard, just to the nature of where the data exists. The fact that the host country progress is opaque, reporting is often not on time or missing zeros. So the job of work has really been to standardize, think through what are the critical things that drive the risks, and present that in a coherent and usable way to help you communicate your decisions and also inform your portfolio and sourcing recommendations and strategy. So that's kind of the scoring framework that sits above the data. I'm going to hand to Aaron now, who's going to talk through the parts of the tool that is more around data aggregation, right? So we know that there are whole teams set up in across the market to aggregate this data, keep it up to date. And yeah, that is painful grunt work. So we're aiming to do that for you. And Aaron's going to give a quick overview of the data that we're collecting.
Great, thank you. I believe everyone sees my screen right now. So I'm going to cover two modules within the Article 6 and CORSIA Hub. One is on ITMO supply, and the second is our analysis of CORSIA. What you're looking at here is our ITMO supply tracker. It looks at various aspects of supply. So first of all, here is the list of projects that are currently eligible for CORSIA Phase 1. They have issued credits and have been tagged as CORSIA eligible already. So you see, basically, we track all the projects that are relevant in this category, where they're from, which developer they're from, the units available, and some indicators of risk that Molly has just talked about. But importantly, we also look at what are the other projects that could be potentially eligible subject to authorization. So the main question there is, are these projects going to receive that authorization in the coming months? And where would they come from, and what kind of price we'll find for them? And of course, behind all of this is a tracker of all the key letters of authorizations. As you see on the screen, we look at every single host country as soon as they have any indications or publications of a letter of authorization available. We track them. We look at which projects they're for, which vintages are available. Within letters of authorization, they also specify the millions of tons that are authorized, and often that is a subset of the project supply. We also look at whether they are defining first transfers, issuances, authorizations, or something else, how they look at corresponding adjustment risk, whether they're CORSIA eligible, and to what extent they are exported from the country. So that is our database on letters of authorizations, and it helps teams understand and with minimal effort, what are the authorization landscape out there and which other countries might join. So that is on a quick tour of ITMO supply, and that's how we track it. It is synchronized on a daily basis so that we look at all the supply sources on the market. Now on CORSIA analysis, it covers some of the elements that I described earlier when it comes to demand scenarios. It looks at the various demand outcomes depending on aviation traffic or the implementation of CORSIA. So right now you're looking at an introductory section of this section. We look at the levels of demand across different CORSIA implementation outcomes and aviation scenarios. In the base case, we have some price projections for phase 1, phase 2, supply demand, and how offsetting requirements vary across jurisdictions. Behind that is the modeling of airline level emissions. This might look familiar because I have just shown the monthly emissions forecasts, and we have a few scenarios around how aviation traffic recovers from the Middle East conflict. And as you can see, we have this modeled at an airline level, what the international aviation emissions are, what the offsetting requirements are under phase 1, and also a quick analysis of who are the most exposed airlines in terms of absolute emissions and tons required. We also look at the regulatory status of CORSIA under different jurisdictions. It's important to note that there are various ways for which governments could enforce CORSIA, and they do not need to follow a uniform model. But at the moment, we look at basically some key countries and jurisdictions, how they look at CORSIA enforcement, and whether it's likely for airlines to comply with CORSIA. We have a market forecast section that looks at in detail the various scenarios that's possible. That refers to earlier, as I mentioned, 3x3x3, so 27 scenarios available just on CORSIA dynamics, looking at different levers that could influence the outcome of CORSIA market. As I said earlier, the level of CORSIA implementation, aviation traffic, but most importantly, the level of supply for Article 6 adjusted credits is critical to the results of this market. And there's still substantial uncertainty, and that's why we have such a huge range of potential scenarios available. So that was a quick tour of the CORSIA analysis section. I'll pass it back to Rory.
Yeah, thanks so much, Aaron. I will say before we move to the Q&A, all of this is a living effort and will be continuously refined and updated based on feedback and engagement with host parties, with market participants, and with capacity building institutions. So we're continually kind of adding to this and making sure that it reflects kind of decision-ready data and is a fair representation of the progress on the ground without being overly punitive to the structural challenges in implementing a scheme like this. Okay, awesome. We're going to move to a Q&A. Thanks so much for the engagement in the chat. I'm just going to go through a few of them. Maybe we can start with a couple of quick questions that were pre-submitted for Molly around eligibility. So Molly, will CORSIA accept ARR credits, including those from ICBCM approved methodologies? And the same question on ODS destruction and other superpollutant project types.
So the body that develops CORSIA's emissions units criteria, which the technical advisory body just applies, right? It can't just randomly revise them. That body decided early on to align unit eligibility with decisions under the UNFCCC Warsaw framework for RED+. So they focused on jurisdiction scale programs to avoid the risk of emissions leakage and to ensure alignment with various national strategies and systems. So ARR is one of 5 activities in the UNFCCC's REDD+ definition, which is why you don't see units from standalone ARR activities in developing countries being eligible for the CORSIA compliance market. That's also consistent with the leakage standard under the PACM, though it sort of remains to be seen how strictly the supervisory body on that side will enforce that. And this is one of a few divergences that we see with ICVCM, which I know is sort of frustrating to those who want like broad market harmonization, but it's reflective of the distinctions in rules that in some cases ICVCM has chosen. I have to assume it's because it simply faces a broader marketplace where voluntary buyers may be interested in those activities regardless of compliance choices being made. On ODS destruction, superpollutant types, they are eligible. Anything that is not on the exclusion list in the regulatory documents under CORSIA is in. And so you've got a sort of negative list approach on the CORSIA side. And that list is fairly limited, including to standalone activities in the REDD+ definition. Larger scale grid connected renewables, and some methodologies for direct air capture or carbon capture and storage. If it's not on that list, it's already in.
Awesome. There's been a couple of questions coming about enforcement mechanisms. So Aaron showed the database of enforcement by jurisdiction with the phase of implementation and various tags, which has been a job of work from the team. Maybe Ben, you could tell us a little bit more around how those enforcement mechanisms are coming into effect and the net impact of them.
Thanks, Rory. Yeah, enforcement mechanisms is something that we hear about a lot, and we've been tracking it for a couple of years. There is a component on the hub that lists out all of the enforcement mechanisms that have been proposed, that are in place. It's quite variable. The strongest enforcement mechanism right now is in Japan, where a airline that does not meet its CORSIA obligations actually loses its license to operate, which is why I think it's no coincidence that the 2 big Japanese airlines, JAL and ANA, they are 2 of the first airlines to retire any kind of meaningful volumes of CORSIA-eligible credits. So Japan is at one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the rules from Brazil, where there is a fixed penalty in place, which is equivalent to around $8 depending on the exchange rate. So some would argue that that is a relatively weak penalty, a weak incentive. There are, of course, also going to be other reasons, though, why airlines in Brazil will choose to participate. There are other regions of the world where there is no prospect of having compliance measures in place through national legislation, and yet we strongly expect those airlines to comply because we've heard from them that they've been told by their host governments that they must comply. It's a question of national legitimacy, of respect for the rules, of being taken seriously on the global stage, that those governments have told their airlines that they must comply. So we don't think it's necessarily the case that airlines will only comply where there is an enforcement mechanism in place, but it's still an important signal for us to keep a close eye on. I think that the suggestions from both the EU and the UK that there's going to be penalties of around either €100 or 100 ton, plus potentially having to still surrender an eligible credit, which could also be a significant additional charge. That's a helpful benchmark, but every country is going to take their own path here. And in general, we expect high compliance, even in countries where there is no enforcement mechanism in place.
Thanks, Ben. There's a great chart in the platform that combines the demand estimates by airline operator with the enforcement rules for the jurisdiction they're operating in. So you can see of those that have the largest exposure, like how much teeth does the enforcement actually have in that jurisdiction. And as Ben signaled, you see Japan on one end those airlines are really likely to comply, and those are the ones that sourcing teams and sellers of CORSIA eligible units should be speaking to. So that is good. Thank you, Ben. We've had a really good question, or a few questions about the EU, which is a very live topic. The question is, what and when are the EU decisions regarding CORSIA enforcement or extending the ETS? And would that extension to aviation undercut reliance on CORSIA? Like, what would the net effect of that be? Ben, maybe you could give us an overview of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Rory. I'll try and be brief. And I saw that this was one of the live questions that came in as well, which was, why is June 2026 so key? The reason June 2026 is so key is because this is a month when the European Commission is due to publish its review of the environmental effectiveness of CORSIA. And there was some reporting last week from Bloomberg that the review is going to conclude, and actually this is no surprise, that the tests that have been set in the EU ETS legislation regarding the environmental effectiveness of CORSIA will not be met. One of those tests, for example, is that 70% of global aviation emissions, I should say international aviation emissions, are covered by CORSIA, and that would not be the case for phase one. It is just a little bit lower than that. So this section of what was leaked was not a surprise. However, it was also suggested in this reporting that the European Commission will propose to extend the aviation ETS to flights leaving the EEA, the European Economic Area, which is actually something that the EU tried to do in 2012, and it sparked a pretty furious diplomatic backlash, including from President Obama in the US, who I believe banned US airlines from complying with this. It was very controversial. There were threats to cancel Airbus orders. And so the EU was made to feel quite a bit of pain for this. It remains to be seen whether this will be the EU position, because for now this is a leaked draft of a paper by DG Klima, which is a part of the European Commission. Whatever rules are finally agreed have to be agreed by the European Parliament, the European Council, which is the 27 member states, and the European Commission, including, for example, DG Move, which is responsible for transport. So I think this should be seen more as a kind of maximalist position for now, which is unlikely to be the final position for the EU. I think the challenge for CORSIA is that in order to get to this final position for the EU, there will have to be quite a lot of negotiations internally, and that could take a long time. These negotiations may well also be linked to the wider negotiations around reform of the EU ETS, and also the wider negotiations around the EU's 2040 climate target. And those negotiations will only kick off at the beginning of next year, because the European Commission is required to publish draft legislation regarding the 2040 target by the end of this year. So there are a few reasons why I think this is likely to drag on for a number of months, which of course could be quite destabilizing for the demand signal in CORSIA. But ultimately, we still think that sense will prevail and that the EU will come down in a pragmatic position. We've seen that a number of member states have already been lobbying quite hard in that direction. There's reports of a letter being co-signed by France and Poland and Czechia and Luxembourg and a number of other member states, which is very pro-CORSIA and very cold on the suggestion that the aviation ETS should be extended to flights leaving the European Economic Area. So I think there's going to be quite a lot of bartering within the EU on this over the next few months. It's definitely a close one to watch. We're tracking it very, very closely indeed.
Thanks, Ben. Also worth noting that several major EU airlines have recently signed on to a aviation carbon markets compact that was published by IATA, which kind of indicates their continued support for CORSIA and its successful implementation. So I think there's going to be strong support from the operators as well. Molly, there's a question for you, I think, here on volumes of authorized supply. Can enough supply be secured given delays in host country authorizations and corresponding adjustments?
So on authorized supply and the sufficiency of supply for phase one, and by that meaning by this time next year, effectively, latest in the fall. At least I'm increasingly optimistic that it could be, given what Silvera was seeing and hearing during the recent UNFCCC subsidiary body meetings in Bonn about various complications with submitting or communicating letters of authorization or refining the ones that exist. A lot of this seems resolvable and technical. So more hopeful now than before, because countries seem to be making up for lost time, filling in reporting gaps, missing reports, several letters of authorization that the broader market and even we were unaware of, that were in development, that are in development, or have been submitted, simply haven't been published yet by the UNFCCC for administrative processes. So there's a lot happening there that isn't visible, but is certainly in the works. And so that was part of the impetus for the Article 6 and CORSIA Hub, to be able to provide that information as soon as it comes to light, so that there's an accurate picture of how that supply is growing.
Amazing. Hard question to end on. I think it's the $1 million question. We're gonna stop there. So thank you so much for all of the questions. I hope you found the presentation useful and informative. As I say, the insights are going to be compiled into a report that will be made available. If you are more interested in some of the underlying granular data and analysis on different scenarios, please do get in touch. We'd be delighted to show you the work that we've been doing. And as ever, thank you so much for attending, and see you next time.